Welcome to Dear Book Coach. I'm Carrie Savage, a writer and book coach outside Boston, Massachusetts.
And I'm Stephanie Detlefs, writer and book coach in Bellingham, Washington.
Hi, and I'm Terry Thayer, writer, book coach, certified focusing professional, and I live outside of Boulder, Colorado.
And this is a friendly advice space as you plan, draft, and revise your novel. In each video, we're going to answer one question submitted by a writer like you with 3 different points of view, and you get to pick the advice that resonates best. So this week, we have a question about writing dialogue from Natalie. Dear book coach, writing dialogue is hard. It comes out of my head easily enough, but when I or my writing group read it, it sounds really stiff and unnatural, like someone put words in their mouths. How do I get my characters to speak like humans? Stephanie, did you want to take this one first?
Yeah, sure. So yeah, Natalie, I get it. Writing dialogue is really hard for sure. So some suggestions that I have include eavesdropping on people. We're starting to get to where we can go out to coffee shops again. So if you can sort of eavesdrop on someone in a coffee shop or a restaurant, take notes on what they say and what their mannerisms are. Maybe not necessarily their exact words, but just snippets of their conversation and the way they phrase things. The things I would recommend that you think about are these. First of all, dialogue has to be moving the story forward. You don't want dialogue that's like, hey, how's it going? Fine, how are you? That sort of stuff just generally isn't useful in a story. So that's the first thing. The second thing I would say is to be careful about using dialogue to explain something that you want the reader to know. See if you can, rather than giving a character a paragraph-long explanation for something, see if you can put some of those details in another place, because that can really weigh down the dialogue. The next thing I would suggest is get into the mind and body of your character who's speaking. So think about things like, how do they speak when they're stressed? How do they speak when they're happy or mad? Do they have catchphrases that they say? Like I say okay and like all the time. So if I were writing my own dialogue, I would need to make sure that those things were in there as well. The tone that the character uses will help convey the emotion of the moment, and it'll help make your dialogue a little bit more authentic. And then after you've written it, I suggest that you read it aloud. You can even ask another person to do the back and forth of the conversation. And I would pay attention to places where you make changes in the dialogue because it doesn't sound right as you're saying it out loud, and make notes directly on your manuscript as you're doing it. So those are my suggestions. Terry, what do you think?
Thanks, Stephanie. Yeah, I used to love to eavesdrop in coffee shops. Those were the days. And you hear some interesting stories, sometimes things that you can put in your book because they're too unbelievable to be true. I really like the idea of a catchphrase, or really leaning into the way your character would speak. I don't personally like dialect. I don't like to read dialect. I find it just distracting. Sometimes it can be done, but I would rather just lean into the jargon of their occupation or their community. Just really lean into the uniqueness of the way that they speak. I would really watch out. Don't take your dialogue off of American television. It's just gotten so stale. People borrow from each other all the time. I've been watching a lot of British TV and just noticing, I haven't heard people say those things in a while. So just watch where you are getting it from. Remember that dialogue is action too, that it's not just, like everything in your story, it has to be doing double or triple duty. So make sure your dialogue is packed with information, but not, as Stephanie said, not thrown at somebody in a paragraph long thing. For example, it's fine if your character is mumbling if she's tied to a railroad track and bound and gagged, or if she just put a mouthful of risotto in when her partner asked her to marry her. You know, then you would be kind of stumbling and fumbling, and that's fine. That's true. Nothing is out of bounds, but just make sure it's doing double and even triple duty if you can. I think that's all for me. Find your colloquialisms. I love, you know, different regions of the country. I love reading those kinds of things. So just make sure they're true to where you're from, and true, if you're writing historical, please make sure that word wasn't invented in 1972, because that really draws me out of a story. What do you think, Carrie?
It's very funny that you say that, because I am working on a historical novel, and there have definitely been places where when people have read my stuff, they say, "Oh, are you sure that that word was, you know, invented in or was in use in 1700?" And in some cases, I've had to defend it, and in other cases, they were absolutely right. So, yeah, what is the online etymology dictionary is your friend in that case. Little plug there for a free tool. But I think it's interesting, you know, one of the things that I had, you know, on my list was also to play Harriet the Spy and listen in on people's conversations. So clearly that's something that all of us would recommend. And I think beware of the writer in your life if you don't want to be eavesdropped on. But really, it's harmless. We're fine. You will not, all identifying characteristics or any resemblance to characters alive or dead, or what's that, you know, disclaimer that goes at the end of books and TV shows and things. Another thing that I have had recommended and have done is to read your dialogue out loud. I have acted things out in my office, and I'm sure if my next door neighbors, since I live in an urban environment, think that it's, you know, I'm crazy, I'm up and moving around and talking. But part of that, you also want to be aware of not making sure that you're not adding emphasis or stress that's not actually there. In other words, you're not infusing your dialogue with a meaning that you know is there because it's in your head, but that wouldn't necessarily be available to your reader in that same place. And so something that could also help with that is, if you do want to hear your dialogue or your work read out loud, is use a text-to-speech software. There's lots of options out there. I don't have the names of any off the top of my head, but there's plenty of free ones. And that's a great way to just have somebody, you know, a disembodied third party read things back to you, and you can pick up on nuances, or especially pick up on things that just don't sound right, that don't sound natural, or, you know, something's missing that, again, I knew because I wrote it. The other thing I guess that I would say is, when you do listen to these day-to-day conversations, make sure that you're, like, that's great, transcribe them, but also look at ways when you're thinking of how to craft them, of how to cut out the fluff. So, you know, we will always walk into a coffee shop and say, "Hi, how are you? How you doing?" You know, that all that introductory stuff. We don't need to read that every single time. I mean, you don't want to just drop somebody into a conversation where, you know, they sit down and they're screaming at each other, or there does have to be some sort of introduction into it, but there's lots of different ways that you can craft that so that you're not getting all of that back and forth that we just as readers don't care about and are just going to distract us. So be mindful of that. And then lastly, think about the relationships between the characters and how they would speak to each other. The tenor of a conversation is going to be different between a parent and a child, and a parent to another parent, or, you know, grandparents, friends. The relationships are really going to matter in terms of what people are going to say to each other. So that is a good way to help you think through not only just the dialogue, which is what we're talking about, but also just the dynamics of the relationship and what information they're giving to each other. Goes back to what Stephanie and Terry were saying about how best to use dialogue. You're imparting information about the relationship in terms of what they are saying to each other. So if you put all of that together, you're going to be able to come up with something that is moving your story forward appropriately, but also doesn't sound like the kind of thing that characters are saying to each other because it just came out of your head, not out of somebody's mouth. So I think that sort of hit everything that all the points I wanted to hit.
Awesome. Well, that's it for us today. We hope that you found an answer that made sense to you at this point in your life and at this point in your book. Remember, you can submit your own question to us anytime at dearbookcoach.com, and we will see you next time. Bye.